You paid for it. You could afford it. And you still felt sick. Not immediately. The purchase itself felt fine, necessary even. But somewhere between the transaction completing and getting home, something shifted. A low-grade discomfort settled in. A voice, not loud enough to argue with, running a quiet audit. Did you need this? Was this the right amount? Could you have found it cheaper? What does this say about you? You have felt this. If you are reading this, you have almost certainly felt this. The guilt that arrives after spending, even responsible spending, even spending you consciously chose with full awareness of your financial situation. This is spending guilt. It is not the same as overspending. You can have it even when you have not overspent. The feeling and the financial reality are operating on different tracks, and the feeling is often telling you something that has nothing to do with the money. The most straightforward version of spending guilt is simple. You were taught somewhere that spending is bad. Not explicitly. Nobody sat you down and gave you that lesson in those words. But money messages are absorbed early and obliquely, through observation more than instruction. If you grew up watching someone in your house treat every purchase as a moral event, a test of character, a measure of discipline, a thing to be either justified or regretted, you learned that spending is not neutral. It has a valence. It means something about you. In this framework, saving is virtue and spending is weakness. Frugality is identity. Every purchase that goes beyond what is strictly necessary is a small failure. Not a catastrophic one. You are allowed to buy things, of course, but a failure of some standard, one that you are not quite living up to, and that standard is vague enough that you can never fully satisfy it. This explains why spending guilt often has no relationship to financial reality. People who are financially healthy feel it. People who are wealthy feel it. The guilt is not a warning signal from your actual financial situation. It is a leftover from a value system you absorbed before you were old enough to evaluate whether it made sense. There is a different version that is harder to untangle. In this version, the guilt is not about an internalized value. It is about identity. Specifically, it is about a version of yourself that the purchase contradicts. If you grew up without money, spending can feel like a betrayal of the people you left behind, of the version of yourself that knew scarcity, of some sense that you do not quite deserve the abundance. The purchase is objectively fine, but some part of you is still standing in the house you grew up in, where that amount of money was not available, and from that vantage point the purchase is incomprehensible. Or, you have constructed an identity around being careful, responsible, not like people who spend carelessly. Spending, even necessary spending, even good spending, introduces a threat to that identity. It makes you feel like the person you have spent years not being. The guilt is the identity defending itself. Or, the spending triggers a specific fear. Not about the money itself, but about what the money represents. Safety, the future, the ability to weather the thing that has not happened yet but could. Every dollar that leaves the account is a dollar that is not there for the emergency. The guilt is anxiety wearing a financial disguise. There is a phenomenon researchers call financial scrupulosity, borrowed from the older concept of moral scrupulosity in religious traditions. Scrupulosity is the experience of persistent guilt and doubt about whether you have done something wrong, in contexts where most people would not feel guilt at all. In the religious version, it is the person who confesses repeatedly over the same small transgression, convinced they are sinful when they are not. In the financial version, it is the person who reviews a purchase they can afford, decided with full information, and cannot stop feeling that they should not have done it. The guilt is disproportionate to the act, but the disproportion itself is not visible from inside the experience. From inside, it just feels like appropriate conscience, like being careful, like not being someone who wastes money. This is one of the reasons spending guilt is so difficult to challenge. It wears the costume of virtue. It feels like responsibility. Calling it guilt, calling it a problem, feels like arguing for irresponsibility. But there is a difference between genuine financial caution and guilt that operates regardless of whether caution is warranted. Genuine financial caution is a tool. It responds to information. If you are spending money you do not have, the discomfort is adaptive. It is your judgment telling you something is wrong. If you are spending money you do have on something you chose and you still feel sick, the discomfort is not about the money. It is about something older. The relationship between spending guilt and control is worth sitting with. Spending, at its core, is an act of agency. You have resources. You direct them. You make a choice about what matters, what is worth having, how you want to move through the world. In this sense, spending is power, the expression of preference and priority. For people who grew up without that power, whose resources were constrained, whose choices were limited, who watched decisions made under duress, the act of freely choosing to spend can be deeply uncomfortable, not despite the freedom but because of it. The freedom itself is unfamiliar. The guilt is the old constraint reasserting itself. A reminder that spending is risky, that having things can be taken away, that the appropriate response to having enough is to hold it tightly, not move it. This is the guilt of someone who has more now than they were supposed to have, and who has not yet given themselves permission to be in that position. What to do with it is not obvious, and anyone who says it is simple is selling something. The most common advice is to make a budget, track your spending, stay within it, and if the spending was in the budget, tell yourself it was fine and move on. This advice is not wrong, but it addresses the cognitive layer and not the emotional one. You can know, rationally, that the purchase was appropriate and still feel sick. The knowledge does not reliably dissolve the feeling. What is more useful, though slower, is to trace the feeling backward. Not to argue with it, but to understand it. When the guilt arrives, instead of trying to counter it with logic, try to locate it. Where does it sit in your body? What is it saying exactly? What does it remind you of? Often, beneath the spending guilt is something much more specific. A memory, a voice, a rule that was never articulated but was always understood. Finding that naming it begins to separate the current moment from the moment it came from. You are not in that house anymore. The purchase that feels transgressive is not transgressive. The rule that says you should feel guilty was not your rule to begin with. You will not stop feeling guilty immediately. That is not how this works. The guilt is fast and the understanding is slow. The reflex is older than the reasoning. But the gap between the feeling and the decision, the space where you notice the guilt without being controlled by it, that gap can widen. And in that gap is the ability to spend on things that matter without afterward spending 3 days recovering from the discomfort of having done so. The purchase was fine. You are allowed to have things. You are allowed to make choices about your own resources without those choices becoming an indictment. That is not irresponsibility. That is just being someone who is allowed to be here.